July 16, 1979. It is just before dawn on the high desert of the Navajo Nation, near the village of Church Rock, New Mexico, about 17 miles northeast of Gallup. The land is quiet and red and empty in the gray light. Sheep are still bedded down in the brush. And behind a 35-foot wall of packed earth sits a still, dark pond of liquid waste from a uranium mill, millions of gallons of it, holding steady against the dam the way it has for years. Down the face of that earthen wall where the ground has slowly settled, a single crack has been working its way deeper. Nobody is watching it this morning. There is no alarm, no guard, no light. Just a crack in a dirt dam, and a pond of poison behind it, on the edge of a river that families downstream depend on to live. At a few minutes past 5 in the morning, the dam gives way. It is one of the smallest, most ordinary ways a thing can fail. Dirt settling, a crack widening. And it is about to send the largest accidental release of radioactive material in American history, rolling down a river through a sleeping community. The danger that morning was never some freak act of nature. The danger was a dam built out of packed earth, on ground that engineers knew was unstable, holding back acidic radioactive waste above a river that Navajo families used for their drinking water and their livestock. The cracks had been found and measured years before. The warnings had gone up to the company and to the state. And the people who lived directly below that dam were never told the thing above their homes was failing. This is the worst nuclear spill in American history. Church Rock, 1979. To make sense of what came down the Puerco River that morning, look first at what a uranium mill is and why one sat above a Navajo river at all. Through the Cold War, the high desert of the Four Corners became one of the largest uranium-producing regions on Earth. The mines and mills fed the bombs and the reactors. United Nuclear Corporation ran an operation at Church Rock that dug the ore out of the ground and crushed it, then used acid to strip the uranium out of the rock. What was left after that process was a slurry of finely ground sand, water, acid, and the radioactive leftovers of the ore. That waste is called tailings. It still carries uranium, thorium, radium, and a long list of heavy metals, and it stays dangerous for a very long time. A mill produces enormous amounts of this stuff, far more than it can ever sell. So the standard practice was to pump it into a pond and let it sit. At Church Rock, the company built that pond on the high ground above the valley, walled in by dams of compacted earth just up the slope from the dry wash that fed the Puerco River. The waste was acidic enough to burn skin. The dam holding it back was made of dirt, rising about 35 feet above the ground below it. And below it, within walking distance, Navajo families lived on the land, grazed their sheep, and drew water from the river and its wells. You have to picture the geography to feel how reckless this was. This is the Navajo Nation, the largest reservation in the country. Dry rangeland where water is the rarest thing there is. The Puerco River is one of the few channels that ever carries water through it, and even then only part of the year. A family's whole survival can run through one stream and the wells beside it. United Nuclear put a pond of acidic radioactive waste on the slope directly above that stream, behind a wall of packed dirt, in a region built almost entirely on the assumption that the water there is safe to drink. The mill brought paychecks, and many of the men who worked it were Navajo themselves, which is part of what makes the story so hard. The same community that was poisoned was also the one that mined and milled the ore. The failure was no mystery, and it was no surprise to the people who had looked closely. Engineers had flagged the ground under the dam as a poor foundation, a soft mix of clay and silt that would settle unevenly and pull a packed earth wall apart. Cracks were found in the dam years before it failed. They were reported as early as 1977 and again in 1978 in the same structure that would later break open. One local man named Larry King, who lived near the mill, later said that just 2 weeks before the disaster he had walked the edge of the impoundment and found cracks in it wide, enough to put his feet into. The problems were documented. The warnings reached the company and the state. The pond stayed full. The mill kept running. Nothing was fixed in time. There is one more piece of the warning that matters, because it ties the cracks directly to the flood. The reports on the dam had pointed at the foundation. The soft clay and silt under the earthen wall that would settle unevenly under the weight of the pond. That is exactly the failure that happened. The ground beneath one section of the dam settled. The wall above it cracked along the line of that settlement, and the crack ran until it reached the pond, so the breach was not a random weak point. It opened along the very flaw the engineers had described before a single gallon ever spilled. The people who wrote those reports had drawn a map of how the dam would fail, and the dam followed it. Now go back to the morning of July 16th. A little after 5, the cracked section of the earthen dam breaches. It does not hold and slowly leak, it opens. Acidic, radioactive tailing solution pours through the gap and down into Pipeline Arroyo, the dry channel that runs toward the Puerco. In a matter of hours, roughly 94 million gallons of contaminated liquid drain out of the pond, along with more than 1,100 tons of solid radioactive waste washed loose by the flood. 94 million gallons. Enough to fill more than 140 Olympic swimming pools, all of it acid and radioactive sludge, moving downhill toward the river. The Puerco River is normally a thin, sandy stream, dry for much of the year. That morning it ran high and strange. The water turned yellow. People who lived along it remembered the smell first, a sharp chemical odor drifting up the valley before anyone understood what it meant. Larry King, who lived nearby, described the terrible odor and the yellowish color of the water. The flood carried its load down the riverbed and kept going. It moved through the Church Rock area, past the edge of Gallup, and on across the state line into Navajo County, Arizona. By the time it spread out and slowed, the contamination had traveled roughly 80 miles downstream, straight through the heart of the Navajo Nation. Think about what the water was carrying. Tests later found the spill water loaded with radioactive uranium, thorium, radium, and polonium, along with a long list of metals: cadmium, lead, selenium, vanadium, nickel, and more, plus heavy concentrations of sulfates and acids strong enough to leave chemical burns. All of that was moving down a riverbed that sheep grazed beside and children played in on a hot July morning, with the sun coming up over the rangeland the way it always did. The people living along that river were not warned before the water reached them. There was no siren. No one came through the night knocking on doors the way they should have. Families woke up to a river that looked wrong and smelled wrong, and they had no way to know that the water their sheep were already drinking carried uranium and acid out of a broken mill upstream. By some accounts, roughly 1,700 people lost their access to clean water that day. The contamination did not announce itself. It just arrived in the one stream a community could not live without. If you are still with me, stay close, because the scale of what that river carried is the thing almost nobody outside the Navajo Nation has ever heard. This is a disaster that fully happened. There was no last-second save, no safety system that held. The dam broke and the poison went where gravity took it. The gut punch here is not how close it came. It is how big it actually was, and how quiet the country stayed about it. The Church Rock spill released around 94 million gallons of acidic radioactive liquid and over 1,100 tons of solid waste into the river. By the measure that matters, the amount of radioactivity set loose, it remains the single largest accidental release of radioactive material in the history of the United States. 4 months earlier, in March of 1979, a reactor at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania had partly melted down. That accident became one of the most famous events of the decade. It put nuclear power on the front page of every newspaper in the country and changed the industry for good. Church Rock released more radioactivity than 3 Mile Island did. By the official accounting, the spill carried roughly 46 curies of alpha-emitting contamination down the Puerco, compared with the much smaller release at 3 Mile Island. The larger nuclear release of 1979 was not the famous one in Pennsylvania. It was the one on the Navajo Nation, and while one became a household name, the other ran down a desert river and largely vanished from the national memory. The cost of that morning was carried by the Navajo families who lived along the Puerco and never agreed to any of it. Their water came from that river and from wells near it. Their sheep and cattle drank from it. After the spill, livestock that drank the water sickened and died. Children who waded into the river, the way children always had on a hot desert morning, came out with burns on their feet from the acid in the water. Some who went into the hospital with those burns were badly hurt, and in the worst cases there was talk of amputation. People in the area reported a sharp, lasting odor in water the color of rust. For a community whose entire way of life ran through that river, the spill did not just contaminate a stream. It took away the water, the grazing, and the trust all at once. For a shepherd along that river, the loss was direct and total. A flock is not just food, it is income, inheritance, and a way of life handed down for generations on that land. When the sheep that drank from the Puerco began to die, families were told the water was unsafe, but they were given little to replace it with. Health workers later found higher levels of radioactive material in Church Rock cattle, and officials told residents the meat posed only a small risk if they did not eat it for years on end. For people who lived on their livestock, that advice was almost meaningless. The long-term health effects on the people of the area have never been fully studied. There has been no large epidemiological study at Church Rock, which means the community has spent decades living with a contamination they can see in the soil and the records, while the human toll stays officially uncounted. The families there will tell you what they believe it did to them. The science was never funded to confirm or deny it, and that silence is part of the injury. Larry King, the former mine worker who had measured those cracks with his own feet 2 weeks before the dam broke, spent the rest of his life as a witness to it. He had seen the warning signs up close. He had watched the river turn yellow, and he watched what came after, as the years passed and the cleanup never matched the damage. He kept telling the story on the land to anyone who would come and listen, because for a long time almost no one outside the reservation was listening at all. The numbers from the response are their own kind of verdict. United Nuclear's cleanup amounted to hauling away around 3,500 tons of contaminated soil from the riverbed, which was later estimated to be only about 1% of the soil the spill had fouled. The other 99% stayed where the flood left it. The governor of New Mexico at the time, Bruce King, refused the Navajo Nation's request to have the site declared a federal disaster area, a decision that cut off aid the affected families could have received. The mill itself was not shut down for good. It went back into operation in under 4 months. The Church Rock site was later placed on the federal Superfund list of the most contaminated places in the country. As of recent years, the federal government still describes the groundwater contamination there as not under control. That was not bad luck, and it was not an act of God. It was a dam of packed earth, built on ground engineers had already flagged as unstable, holding back acid and radioactive waste above a river that a native community drank from, with cracks that had been found and measured and reported years in advance. Every piece of the failure was known. The company kept the mill running. The state did not force the fix, and when the dam finally broke and poisoned the river, the people in charge treated it as a local problem in a remote place, not a national emergency. The poison reached the Navajo. The attention did not. Today, the Puerco riverbed still runs through Church Rock, dry for much of the year, the same red sand and brush it has always been. The old mill site and its tailings sit a short distance up the slope, fenced and flagged, still on the Superfund list. The groundwater beneath it still moving in ways the cleanup has never gotten ahead of. People still live on that land. Crews still test the soil and the water. And most of the country has never heard the name Church Rock at all. You can read a dozen histories of nuclear America and find 3 Mile Island in every one of them, and never once come across the spill that released more. The frightening part of Church Rock was never just one broken dam on one summer morning. It is the question of how a country can have its single worst nuclear spill run for 80 miles through a community's drinking water, with the cracks known years in advance, and still let it become the disaster almost nobody talks about. If you made it this far, thank you for being here. These stories take a long time to research and put together, and every like, comment, and subscription genuinely helps keep the channel going. If you want more stories like this one, consider subscribing. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.